Hello and welcome back. So before we get too far into this video, I'm going to show you two clips of the types of mistakes that I'm going to talk about later in the video. And I want you to think for yourself which of these two is worse and which would lead to an overall lower win rate. First one is in a combat playing Strike and then playing Bash. For your second mistake, you're playing as the defect in the Overgrowth. You just finish off a Nibbit and you get a card reward. That card reward is a boot sequence. And you decide to take boot sequence going into Ceremonial Beast after your first card reward in the Overgrowth. So for the first mistake, we can actually simulate exactly how impactful this type of mistake will be on the rest of our run. So I did a Monte Carlo simulation, which basically means I just wrote a program to play a couple hundred combats and look at the results. So the Bash mistake, I basically in the program said, if you're going to play Bash, always play it last. Or actually I made Vulnerable not work the turn Bash is played, but same thing. Basically Bash is always played after other attacks in the turn. Optimal play plays it in whatever way does most damage, so Bash and then Strike. In the Stinker Beetle fight, it was within the margin of error of the simulation. Bash mistake and optimal play showed no discernible difference. And one point I want to get across, because I'm going to show a lot of these types of graphs, is these are kind of showing visual clarity over exactness. The damage and block values in Slay the Spire are discrete, but this is kind of a mess to look at. So I'm basically getting like the envelope of these profiles to make these graphs. So it's like, you know, there's not a continuous distribution of damages, but I think for the visual demonstration purposes, that's why I'm doing it. So you can just look at it and immediately understand two overlapping distributions. So anyway, I did this simulation of this type of gameplay for some of the other early combats as well. The Bash mistake on the Nibbit is more impactful here. You lose about half a damage or half a life more, making this mistake compared to optimal play. But that is still roughly within the limits of like margin of error of this simulation. These kind of hovered around plus or minus 0.3 of each other. So we're still within margin of error. And then Fuzzy Worm Crawler was quite similar, about half a damage more, making the Bash mistake, but very small. Now, why is this? Well, it's because on turns you're doing damage. You're doing, on average, like between 12 to 27 damage, depending on your strikes or whatever. And going Strike before Bash, you're missing out on 3 damage in situations where that comes up, but that doesn't always come up. And if you're killing with 27 damage, the odds that 3 damage makes a difference that turn are pretty low. And even if they do make a difference, the odds are, like the odds that you take damage instead of like blocking, also don't matter that much. So this type of a mistake, in-turn mistake, if you did it on every single combat of the easy pool fights, you might take 1 extra damage from the entire first 3 combats. So mistakes like this are almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And if just a real, like, measurable comparison, anyone who's gotten up to Ascension 8, I've never heard anyone complain about Ascension 8. If you have, then, you know, totally valid. But Ascension 8 gives all enemies more HP. And so you can think of the difficulty increase that this gives you as like messing up Bash Strike. So Verdanus going from like 81 HP to 90 is equivalent to missing the Bash Strike sequencing 3 times in one combat. Or Knowledge Demon going from 379 to 399, that's kind of like messing up Bash Strike 7 times in one combat. And for many of us, at least personally and from what I've seen, Ascension 8 isn't a big milestone in terms of difficulty. So this type of like, oh, you missed a little bit of damage on the enemies is a lot less noticeable than other things. So just a couple examples of like what I mean when I'm talking about in-turn mistakes. I'm just saying things that, like, if you look at your hand and you played the cards in your hand in the wrong order. So like if you go Anger before Setup Strike, or like you forgot to play Go for the Eyes before All for One, or you accidentally played Friendship before your attacks. These are the type of the things that I'm talking about. And in general, I would say these are the most obvious mistakes to point out. In fact, like 90% of my YouTube comments are pointing out things like this that I get wrong. And I understand as a viewer, it's the easiest thing to spot. But I just want to make sure that people understand that these maybe are like 3% of your win rate. So they're really obvious, but they're not particularly important. And by that I specifically mean this is not going to make the difference if you're struggling winning on A10 at all, right? If you get perfect micro, going from like 5% to 8% win rate, you're not really going to notice that type of change. And I think it kind of gets lost because there's so much emphasis because this is the most obvious thing to see. Like fancy sequencing, you can think of the opposite of this, right? Like making a really fancy play to get 2 extra damage. It's cool. It's really important, especially at like if you're trying to win streak a lot. But if you're the viewer just trying to beat A10, most of the time, it's not going to matter to you. Yeah, like I said, if you're going for a big win streak, this type of thing does matter. Like going from a 93% win rate to a 96% win rate will double your odds of hitting a 20 streak. So if you're doing that, yes, this is important. But even then, most players kind of play pretty loose, and they only tighten up after they've started a streak of like 5 in a row, because going from 93 to 96% win rate really doesn't change the odds of hitting a 5 streak that much. But anyway, most of us aren't caring about streaks, especially this early in the game's history. Like we don't even have Act 4. So if you're struggling with winning, or a really common thing I see as well is people will like watch my videos and they'll say, when I'm watching your videos, it makes sense, it's easy, but then when I play, I lose and I don't know why. And so the purpose of this video is to say, you're much better focusing on the other things instead, because this is where the majority of your win rate is going to come from. So by now you probably can guess the second mistake is a significantly worse mistake, and we're going to talk about why. So we're in the overgrowth specifically, and boot sequence is just one example of many different types of picks like this, where it's a good card. I think boot sequence is totally playable in many different situations, but specifically in the overgrowth, after you've already fought Nibbit, which I had, there are a lot of problems with this pick. So this is where we get into planning. 66% of the remaining easy combats, they don't even attack on turn 1. So your turn 1, you're going to have less damage. These are damage checks anyway. So you have less damage output in these. 66% of the upcoming elites also don't attack on turn 1. So if you're planning to fight elites, which we were in the video, boot sequence will be a dead draw, very unhelpful into both of these. And specifically, the boss that we know that we're facing also does not attack on turn 1. And most of these fights are a damage check. So being down 1 card on turn 1 for essentially the rest of the act is like you gave yourself a negative bag of preparation. Or half of one, I guess. And that's very, very, very significant. So the problem with this pick is that there's no plan, right? You're taking a card that generally kind of fits your deck. It's good block. Your deck is missing block. But like, what problem are you solving with this pick? None. In fact, you're creating problems by taking this. And that's what causes losses. I just want to get across, like, cards aren't good or bad. Like, boot sequence, I think, is a playable card in many situations. It solves problems. But you got to start thinking that cards are tools, and you use those tools to solve specific problems. So every time you take a card, you have to have a reason why you're taking this card. Do you need to block on turn 1 for the rest of this act? They say no, because almost all of them don't care about turn 1 block. So when we reframe this and we look at this, then you look at these cards are asking questions. Do you need more damage? If so, you can take Momentum Strike. Most of the enemies coming up like you having more damage. Do you need to hit multiple enemies? There's a Frog Parasite coming up. Sweeping Beam can help you into that. Boot Sequence is asking the question, do you need block on turn 1? Nothing is saying, hey, you're going to want block on turn 1. And so that's one part of the problem, is you have a dead draw. The other problem is you're also missing a good card, right? If you take Boot Sequence here, you're getting basically something that does nothing for the whole act, instead of something that could be really good for your deck, like a Momentum Strike. And so I'm using Injury just as an example. So I started with a specific example of Boot Sequence. There are many cases like this where you just take a card that's not useful for the problems you're going into. And so I'm just using an Injury as like a generic curse to represent what it's like when you take that kind of card. And so now we can actually run a simulation to compare the previous kind of error to this one. One little like weird point of disclaimer for this is the Ironclad deck is much easier to simulate than the Defect deck. So I'm just testing Curse versus like an 11 damage attack with the Ironclad deck in these plots. But you can see it's a very significant change, right? So optimal play in this case means you took, in this case, I just did a card that does, I guess Momentum Strike currently does 11 damage. So I basically gave you an attack that does 11 damage compared to giving you a curse. Reran the simulation. So optimal play, you're taking less damage than you were, with no cards added. But now you're taking a lot more damage here. For Nibbit, it's slightly less significant because Nibbit just kind of hits you no matter what. But it is still significant. And this one is very dramatic. It's like 6 damage extra from taking the curse. And this compounds over the run. So if you take like boot sequence on your first combat and then you take a speculative feral, this type of card also is the perfect example of like this in action where you're taking basically a curse. If you don't have any zero cost attacks, feral does nothing. So basically, if you take boot sequence feral as your first 2 picks compared to like a momentum strike and maybe like a ball lightning or something, it's like you have 2 curses compared to 2 good cards. And so we can simulate what happens if your first 2 picks are kind of bad like this, and it's dramatic. That's a lot worse outcomes. Same for Nibbit, and same for Fuzzy Wormcrawler. So we can actually plot the relative trajectories, right? If these are your first 3 combats, so I just did a simulation of facing those 3 combats 200 times in random orders. Floor 1, right, you haven't taken anything. And Sloppy Micro has slightly worse outcome than playing perfectly. Like we said, it's like half a damage sometimes. It's not even really enough to show up on this graph. But then Poor Planning, it dips significantly. And this is with the Ironclad, right? So you're going to start healing health if you take less than 6 damage per combat. Whereas Poor Planning, you like really start dipping in health pretty quickly because your cards aren't doing stuff. You're taking more damage from the fights. Not going well. And this gets significantly worse when we start looking at elites. So by this time, you've had 3 picks. And this is, again, a simplified example of what's actually happening, but the easiest way to demonstrate stuff is kind of simplification. So if we simulate 3 curses, right, if your first 3 picks are bad compared to, I just gave them 3 momentum strikes, so 3 cards that just do 11. The gap widens significantly, and like you're just dying to the elite. One point I want to get across, this number is still quite high. That's because this is completely ignoring potions. This is saying you just do, there's no Niao's bonus. This is saying you just do 3 combats right to an elite, so you don't get upgrades or anything. Just so we can simplify and demonstrate. So optimal play, you should be taking less than 40 damage on average, but if you did just get 3 momentum strikes and fight a Burdanis, this is roughly what you can expect to take in terms of damage. And so this is what your trajectory will look like in the 2 separate instances, your average life total. Sloppy Micro is in blue. You'll come out at like 30 HP if you run into Burdanis too early. Poor Planning, you're going to be at negative 30. So it's a very significant difference. And so I get so many people saying that they lose a bunch of HP, fight an elite, and die. And this is a major cause of it. You're taking cards that don't solve the problems that you're about to run into. And so for that, we need to talk about planning, because planning is essentially solving that problem. The cards you're taking have a purpose, they have a plan, you have a reason for them. And this is how you get into Act 3. It's one of the most important aspects of Slay the Spire. And so planning comes down to basically 1, identifying problems, and 2, finding solutions to those problems. I would say this is Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire is not a game about playing bash before strike or like fancy, getting 2 damage out of it. It's finding problems, finding solutions. And most of this part of the game happens outside of combat completely. So what types of problems do you identify? Well, typically there's next fight. You always have to ask yourself, am I prepared for the next fight? If not, what can I do to make myself more prepared for the next fight? You might have to skip out on your favorite card to take a boring damage common just to be able to kill a Nibbit to keep your HP high. Then, if you have next fight solid, right, you've got some good cards, you're doing damage, it's fine. Then you need to start asking, what's coming up in this act, right? Do I have to face this frog parasite? Do I need AoE? Like, how am I going to handle the fights we have coming up? And this is where the boot sequence really caused a problem, because you're not solving this act And you weren't even really solving this next fight either, because none of the next combats like require you to block on turn 1 either, because we had already fought Nibbit. Once you get these solved, then you solve this run. So you kind of go every single floor. You first ask, do I have this fight solved? Then you ask, do I have this act solved? Once you have this act solved, you're basically looking at what can I do to make myself better against the Act 3 bosses. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So first, the next fight. What am I going to fight, right? You should know, if you're in the underdogs, like what types of enemies are coming up. Tracking like easy pool versus hard pool combats. For those who don't know, the first 3 fights in Act 1 are easier. Then you enter a completely different pool of fights. Those get much harder. In Act 2, it's only the first 2 combats that are easy. So keeping track of that and just asking, do I have the tools to handle combats that show up in these pools? And so in the early overgrowth, for example, damage and block are pretty helpful against these two. Against these 2 fights, damage is mostly all that helps. They're just kind of a damage race. So in general, like front-loaded damage is like useful for 70%, 75% of combats. Block is 25%. You really don't need any scaling in the early overgrowth. And if you disagree on these specific numbers, that's fine. Everyone has different, like block also helps, but damage is typically more helpful. But that's not the point of this. The point is just like, whatever your measurement of what you need coming up is, do that. Plan for that. Scaling is not it though. Like, don't be taking powers and stuff. Like, expertise and feral, we can all agree, do not solve any of the problems that these fights present. So, early overgrowth, the problems you have are the combats. The solutions to those problems are cards like Momentum Strike, Anger, and Dash, getting you strong enough to get through those fights without taking too much damage. How do you know that you're ready? This is very basic, but you look at your deck and you form a damage plan and a block plan. And I mean literally look at your deck, go through the cards, and say, like, what is the most efficient way that my deck can do damage? What is the most efficient way that my deck can block? And you can literally calculate it out. Like, oh, here we go. Yeah. What is the most efficient way my deck can deal damage every cycle? How much damage is it? What's the HP of the enemy coming up? And so, for example, if you're playing the Ironclad, the most efficient damage of the base deck is going Dash Strike, which does 17, and then Strike, 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 while they're still vulnerable, which does 27, which is 44 damage total. So your peak damage, if everything goes perfect, is almost exactly enough to kill the Nibbit. So that's why it's kind of the first combat you usually see, because your base deck has a damage plan that is roughly proportional to the enemy you're about to fight. But as the game goes on, obviously enemies get harder, so you need to form better damage plans. Something that I've been enjoying lately is just taking Howl from Beyond with no synergy. We're not taking this to exhaust, we're literally taking this 3 energy, do 18 damage to all enemies, because this is kind of a solution to the problem that Frog Parasite presents, which is he spawns 4 minions with like 18 to 22 health. If you get like 1 or 2 strength, this can one-shot almost all of them. This is a card that solves a problem you have coming up. You're not taking it because it's good with exhaust. You're not taking it because it's necessarily a good card. You're taking it because the fight that's coming up, this card helps with that fight. Another example, Blade Dance, if you're, playing Silent into the statue. This is remarkably good. Shivs in general are remarkably good into the statue because every card you play makes this guy take 10% more damage. So like playing Blade Dance and then all the Shivs, this is like 13 damage. And then plus 40% damage to all other attacks during that turn. Really, really good card for the fight. They don't have to be cards. You can take Potion of Thorns to hit this guy back. This is just kind of a potion that does 24 damage plus against this guy. And these are just a couple examples, right? And another point people ask, like, how do you know what elite you're going to fight? You don't know specifically, but you know that they're going to be there. So every time you fight an elite, there's a 33% chance you're fighting this guy, 33% chance you're fighting this guy. And so you need to take cards that solve all of those problems before you fight them. So you got to ask yourself, if this elite is Frog Parasite, am I prepared? Or, you could say, how good am I against all the elites? If you're good against all the elites except Frog Parasite, maybe you take this Howl from Beyond, it solves this problem. Now you've solved all the upcoming problems for this act. And then you can fight the elite, confidently knowing you can handle everything that's going to come your way. So just a summary of damage and block plan, like literally count the best damage your deck can do against enemies you're going to face. at least as you're getting used to it. I don't do this because I kind of have like an intuitive sense of what, like over time you'll kind of be able to do this subconsciously, but as you're practicing, just look at your deck and be like, how much damage can I do? And then the goal is basically taking cards, relics, and potions that increase those numbers if you need to increase the damage or block. That's basically kind of deck building and Slay the Spire, and you just kind of do that over and over. Eventually, you're killing the last boss. I've made a whole video that goes in depth about this, specifically how to navigate combats. Like once you've formed your damage plan, how do you execute that in combat? What does that even look like? So I really recommend watching this video because it's very helpful if you want more detail on having a plan, executing the plan. And lastly, we'll talk about scaling. Scaling is essentially how you beat Act 3 bosses. You can think of it as a subset of planning. It's just like planning further ahead, essentially. I've broken them down because it's easier to talk about on its own. But this, I would basically say, if you're worried about scaling, ask yourself these two questions. How can I deal 1,000 damage? Or how can I become invincible? If you can answer either one of these questions confidently, you have scaling. Why 1,000? It's just a number that's big enough to give you a sense of like, you can't achieve this through playing like one card a bunch of times. So just as an example of how can I deal 1,000 damage, Voltaic is a pretty good example. Like channel 122 lightning with Thunder out does quite a bit of damage. I had 2 Voltaic in the deck, so this turn I did about 2,000 damage, or I killed him from full intangible. Thrash is another card that scales up to 1,000 damage pretty quickly. Like this attack is doing 350 something, and the next attack would be doing like 600. So you just kind of play Thrash 3 times in this deck in particular to get a kill. In this case, I had Knife Trap with like Envenom with Snecko Skull, so everything's doing 2 poison with double. All my shields were doing like 12 damage. So this was doing like 400 damage plus poison over time helps you do damage very quickly. These are some of the obvious examples, but there's tons of different ways to scale. But generally, if you're thinking about scaling, you just gotta ask yourself, does this help me deal 1,000 damage or become invincible? And the answer for Celestial Might is typically no. You want something that's more multiplicative or has compounding value like No Escape. So I've made a graph just as a couple of examples of different cards in scaling. Celestial Might is linear damage. There's no curve, there's no bend to this plot here. It's just kind of straight. You play the card, you get damage. You play the card a second time, you get the same amount of damage. So if you wanted to do 1,000 damage with Celestial Might, it would take you 56 plays to do that, which is pretty unfeasible. Contrasting, No Escape is like the perfect example of scaling. You'd only have to play it like 10 times to do, I said 1,000 damage, 1,000 doom, roughly. This card on its own can handle almost any fight, because every time you play this, you get more effect than the last time. And that's why you get like a curve to this graph. The derivative is non-zero, essentially, for those who are in calculus. And so you get increasing or acceleration into your plot. That's what we're looking for, something that accelerates the plot going up. Fight Me, as an example, if you just played Fight Me a bunch of times, the first time it does 10 damage, then you gain 3 strength. So the second time you're doing 8 damage twice, you're doing 16. Then the third time you do 11 damage twice, you're doing 22. If the math is wrong, but basically you're increasing your damage over time. And then Noxious Fumes, you don't even have to play this multiple times. This is just kind of quadratic scaling over time because you keep applying poison and that just grows damage over time. So with scaling, we're just trying to find things that bend the curve this way. And you can play multiple cards. Like these are very simplified examples, but if you played Fight Me every turn, it takes you about 18 turns. If you played Fight Me into Conflagration, that only takes you about 9 turns to do 1,000 damage. So 1,000 feels pretty unfeasible, but you only need 9 turns. This isn't even upgraded Fight Me, by the way. And you could play other cards, get more energy. You have some relics, vulnerable. Like there's ways to do this in like 4 turns very quickly. And scaling also, a lot of these cards are pretty obvious. Like it's do the thing and then get more of the thing. That's not the only way to scale. I think Barricade is a pretty good example of a card that provides scaling in kind of a unique way where block is not removed. This lets you accumulate block over time. And this is kind of the type of scaling where you just become invincible. Like stone armor gives you plating. That plating like keeps applying and you keep getting more value. Same with Crimson Mantle. This turns Crimson Mantle normally just gives you block every turn. But with Barricade out, Crimson Mantle accumulates block, so you can start growing your defense, become invincible essentially. You can body slam, like there's a bunch of things you can do with the Barricade to continue to scale. This gives me the Demon Form, which is a card I talk about all the time. And I get people saying this is like a bad card, it's unplayable. It's not a bad card. Cards aren't like good or bad. Cards exist to solve problems. If your deck has no scaling and you need scaling, you can take Demon Form and single-handedly solve that problem. That is a very useful thing for a card to do. If you don't need scaling, this card isn't solving a problem you need, and then you don't have to take it. That's pretty much it. But like, just with the starter deck, if you play 3 strikes every single turn, it takes 56 turns to do 1,000 damage. Just playing Demon Form in the starter deck, playing 3 strikes every turn, it only takes 14 turns to do 1,000 damage. So this is a 1-card scaling solution. If scaling is the problem that you need to solve for the boss, you can take this card. Yes, you're going to take some damage the turn you play it, but without this card, if you don't have scaling, you're going to lose anyway. So you take this card, you play it, you take some damage the turn you play it, it solves the problem, you can win the fight. It's great. It might not be the best form of scaling, but it is cool that it is 1 card that basically handles that whole avenue, or the whole axis. The tricky part of scaling is that we can't force scaling too early, right? I talked about specifically taking Feral, like part 1 of the Overgrowth, and it leads to this kind of problem where scaling cards like Demon Form and stuff too early act like a curse because you don't need scaling at that time. This is a problem of basically taking good cards but not solving the right problems, because you need to solve the upcoming combats first before you can actually start scaling. And so I show this plot a lot in all of my like character guides, but basically you need to draft immediate benefits in a way that seamlessly builds in scaling. And I think this is probably the most important skill in Slay the Spire in general, is finding ways where you can take cards like Bulwark. You take Bulwark if you need block. It happens to give you Forge, so it gives you a little bit of damage. Then you're like, okay, well maybe I need to make the sword a little bit bigger. Refined Blade, like, boost your damage output. Now you have some sword generation. So then you can start taking things like Summon Forth, more sword damage, get the sword back. By this point, you know, you've taken block when you needed it, taken damage when you needed it. Then when you're offered a Sword Sage, you can take this and it immediately boosts your damage and you're golden. If you do this in the opposite order, right, you have Sword Sage, which does literally nothing the turn you take it. So you have a curse. Summon Forth gives you a tiny sword. You don't have anything to get back. Like, the order you draft the cards in matters so much. As we saw before, you can't afford to have a curse in your deck for a while. And so the important like skill in Slay the Spire is knowing like what different directions you can go to synergize with the cards that you've taken. So like you take a Blood Wall early, maybe you need block. Then in your mind, you're kind of picturing Blood Wall does damage to me. It's really good with Rupture and Inferno. Blood Wall gives me a lot of block, gives me survivability. That's pretty good for building up strength with Demon Form. Cascade's good with Blood Wall because you get 2 energy worth of card when you cascade into it instead of 1. Blood Wall's good with Barricade because it again helps you build up block to become invincible. You can use it with Unmovable and Body Slam to start doing damage. Like, there's all these different directions you can go with the card. And I think a lot of people focus on one, right? You're like, Blood Wall, I'm looking for specifically Inferno. And that's the wrong way to think of it, because that's only one of many different things you can be doing with this card. And the skill is identifying all of these and getting flexible enough where if you're not offered these cards, you can move into doing some of these other things. Or just another example, you take an early Cold Snap, then you can go into like getting a bunch of orbs and blocking, or take a Hailstorm to start doing damage. Defragment can grow the focus, and you can go into like Orb Focus. Capacitor Mod, you could also go like Barrage for damage, or Compile Driver to control cards. You can use the Frost Orbs to help you survive, so you can play Powers to then scale that way. So there's so many different ways you can synergize with the cards that you're taking. And you might only be like looking for a Hailstorm with Cold Snap, but the skill is there's so many options. So the point I want to get across, you might take a Cold Snap and you might never see any of these cards. You might have a list of all the things you can do with it, you could literally open none of them. But the thing is, then you're opening other cards. So like you're guaranteed to see some cards. So maybe you take a charged battery instead. Then you take the charged battery and then you see like a Tempest or, some energy stuff and you can go into that direction. Or machine learning charged battery, like this effectively costs 0. So over time, you're getting good block, or you can move into like turbo skim hologram stuff. So basically, you might not see what you're planning for. The plan might change, but you're guaranteed to see cards. And so in those cards somewhere, there is a way to make scaling happen seamlessly, and that is the skill of Slay the Spire. Learning these networks is a significant portion of skill in Slay the Spire, so you can scale with any random collection of cards. So if the game is feeling like luck, you're probably only looking up here, and you're missing all of these skills down here that actually make the game fun and interesting, and like that's the best part of Slay the Spire. So I would say it is not luck, but if you're looking for specific combos, as we said before, right? If you take charge battery and you're like, I know charge battery is good with Tempest, you might not never see Tempest. If you're only looking for this one combo, then the game becomes luck based because you're just gambling. But if you open your eyes and you figure out what other cards this is good with, the game stops being about luck, starts being about skill, and you can like build different unique decks on the fly, and that's the whole fun about this game. So if you work with what you're given, you can have an excellent run essentially every single time. So the way I would put this, you're guaranteed plenty of cards and relics in every single run. Maybe not the ones you want, but it's your job to make them into something awesome. I have a couple, I post videos every single day, but I'm highlighting some example videos. The two on the left, I'll link these in the description, or I posted them in the last couple days. These have some pretty cool, like unique scaling that I've never done before, and I just kind of found on the fly. So if you want to see some unique scaling on the left, that's good. Salvaging a bad start. So this video, I think something about making pull from low damage. I basically started with 2 curses because I transformed. This is a good example of like what to do in that kind of situation. And then this one on the bottom is good for planning for hard matchups. This is having a plan, right? I had an all-in Souls deck. I beat both of these guys no problem because we planned ahead. We solved the problem before we got there, basically. So in summary, I would say in-turn sequencing makes about 3% of your win rate. It is useful if you're trying to win like 100 in a row. Most of us are just trying to win almost every single run. So it's useful. I'm not saying don't care about it, but the reason why a lot of streamers you see make mistakes like this is because we're focusing on the 97% of the game down here, which is having a plan and scaling, which is actually what drives the game forward. And so in summary, Slay the Spire is a game about identifying problems, finding solutions. If you like videos like this, please consider subscribing. They really help the channel out, and it lets me know that you want me to make more videos like this. So if you enjoyed it, please subscribe. I'll see you next time.